We have one more major relation to get through, which I personally consider to be the most exciting relation. This relation is perspective on. And what it does is it distinguishes between a neutral frame, which has no perspective, or at least not the perspective of the child frames. And then there are two or more perspectivized frames, which choose a more specific perspective on that larger scenario. So if you're an ontologist, you would want to know about the following fact. The frames are mutually entangling, and that's transitive. So that means that since buying is a perspective on the goods transaction, and selling is a perspective on the goods transaction, that means that whenever you have buying, you have selling, which is true. So this particular relation can be very useful for doing paraphrase. And in fact, here we have the commerce good transfer, and there are two perspectives. There are actually more, but these are the two I'm going to talk about. There's the seller's perspective and the buyer's perspective, and you get two different verbs. So you have these three frames, just very sketchily put. In the goods transfer, all you know is that the goods change hands, right? Hasn't chosen any perspective. Just the goods, they were with this guy, and now they are with that other guy. The buyer is construed as the agent for buying. The seller is construed as the agent. And in fact, that shows up in the inheritance that those two frames are related to. So buying inherits from getting, and selling inherits from giving with the right bindings. Now, we actually know that in the real world, in order something to count as selling, both parties are agents, right? And in a way, this actually tells you that, right? So because buy and sell are part of the overall goods transaction, their perspectives on the goods transaction, then that tells you that whenever you have buying, you have somebody who's intentionally buying something, then you also have selling, which has somebody intentionally selling something. In terms of paraphrase, if I say, I bought cheese from you, then I can also say, you sold me cheese. And if I paraphrase one level up, then I can say that cheese commerce occurred. It's a ridiculous paraphrase, but it's totally possible. I mean, it's clearly an okay conclusion, at least. The paraphrase works in both directions. And so not only can I start with, I bought cheese from you, I could start with, you sold me cheese, and get, I bought cheese from you, right? So now let's go through a couple of examples. Give paraphrases of the following based on a shift in profiling. Okay? So I'm going to help you out with the first one. It should be relatively obvious, but actually Go in FrameNet we don't have this frame. We could have this frame, but it's the other perspective on commercial transaction, the goods transfer, that I wasn't telling you about, right? So goods transaction has the buyer's perspective, seller's perspective, and the goods perspective. And all of those will allow all the other paraphrases. So just to be sure that people understand what's going on here, let's get a paraphrase from this sentence. Can somebody who has a microphone pass it to somebody who is over there? All the way over on this side of the class.
Okay, the expression went for is vendida in Portuguese? Yes. The house was sold for $20 million.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. Can you paraphrase it with buy?
With the same elements in the phrase, in the sentence, was bought.
The house was bought. You could also use an active sentence, but if you wanted to use an active sentence, you would have to put somebody,
Yes.
right? So you know that somebody bought the house for $20 million, okay? So very generic. In general, we have this problem. If the original sentence doesn't have the frame element, but the paraphrase does, you have to do something. Either you get it from context or you replace it with someone or something.
Michael, is it possible in English to say 20 million pays for this house?
No.
No? Okay.
No.
In Portuguese it would be.
Okay, so that tells me that there's probably yet another perspective in Portuguese that maybe we don't even have in English. Okay. So probably there's a fourth perspective on this event, which is the money's perspective.
And usually the service or the thing you're buying is a DNI.
Right.
So you can say in Portuguese, 10 reais pagam.
I see.
In fact, you would say 10 real paga, but it's...
Yeah, well, that's, yeah.
Like 10 reais pay.
Yep. Actually, there is that same perspective in English, and it's really ridiculously close to this one, and so very confusing to second language learners. The house, $20 million went towards the house, or $20 million went for the house. So you can absolutely switch, now you have to add an extra preposition that's a different one, and that's how we know which one is meant, but there you go. Okay, so let's look at the second sentence. I took a job with Warner. And let's just say that Warner is a company, just to be clear, and make it easy.
Okay.
What's a paraphrase from a different perspective?
We could say that from the perspective of Warner, we could say that Warner hired me.
Absolutely. Yep. Very good. Pass the microphone just there. Should I switch to Portuguese? So now look at the third sentence. The debate was annoying to me. And annoying is the target, of course.
Poderia dizer que
Could I say that I got irritated with the debate?
Yes, that's a good perspective shift. Is there another perspective that you can think of? There's at least 3 for this one. Keep in mind, I'll give you a little hint. Annoyed is an adjective, right? And annoying is an... Can you paraphrase with a verb?
o debate me irritou, me chateou.
The debate irritated me, annoyed me.
Yeah,
Sim.
absolutely. Yep. So can we grab the mic and put it over here? How about the fourth one? As we watch the city filled with fog, and the target is Phil.
Eu posso dizer,
Could I
como
say
nós
that
assistimos,
as we
a
watched,
neblina cobria.
the fog covered the city?
Yeah.
See?
Absolutely.
See?
Yeah. All right. So for the last one, I warn you that the paraphrase is very weird.
Esses dois cupcakes.
The 2 cupcakes are necessary to me.
That's it, absolutely.
Certo.
So it's a hilarious paraphrase. And I have a lot of experience with hilarious paraphrases because whenever you produce paraphrases sort of automatically, you can end up with weird stuff. Okay, so we're done with the exercise part. And so I'm going to move on to other stuff, unless somebody has a question. Thiago.
Okay. I'm the most annoying student to this lecture today. So the question is the following. When you showed that both when you have commerce by, you have commerce cell, correct? Then what follows that is that the same, at least core elements in one perspectivized frame must be present at the other, or no?
No.
No? It's
All
just
you-
that in the key example, it's true,
Yep.
right?
Yep. So perspective does not at all say that the frame elements have to be the same. We know that the profiling is different. And we also know that at least from a sort of logical viewpoint, and also from a speaker's presupposition viewpoint, that the other frame elements are, so to speak, there. So even though in the first example here, the house went for $20 million, there is a way to express the buyers. But, so I can say the house went to the old couple for $20 million. But I cannot in any way express the seller with this phrasing. If I choose go, then I cannot use the seller at all. But everybody would agree that when you have a sentence like this, that there is a seller. You might not be able to say it in this sentence, but everyone would agree. And that's what's necessary for perspective. If in the other frame, there would be examples where some people, in some cases, would say, oh, there doesn't have to be a seller at all, or something like that, then it's not a perspective relation. It's going to be something else. Could be a using relation. Could be something more complicated with several different relations in between. Yeah? So I'll give you one tiny little example which is like that. So there, the second to last example with Phil, I'm actually fibbing a little bit because you need two relations to do that paraphrase. Because there's a perspective relation and an inheritance. Because whenever things move, they don't necessarily cause anything to be full. Whenever things get full, then of course something is moving in order to do that. So you would need a pair of relations in order to do that. But we'll skip past that for the rest of this. Okay, so as mentioned before, we need all this stuff for the employment relations. I think we've been through pretty much every piece of the employment scenario. And you can see that with all of these relations, if I had something, especially towards the end of the process, so that I could also use subframes to do paraphrase, then if I say, I quit working at Warner, then there's a huge number of things that you could say. Because basically, every one of these frames, which is on the left-hand side, there's something I could say there. I can say that Warner hired me. I can say I hired on with Warner. I can, and so on with all these things. Okay? So the number of paraphrases gets very large very quick, even if the frames only have a few words in them each. All right, very briefly, causative of, it's pretty straightforward to paraphrase. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. If I have something like the squid attached its tentacles, then the paraphrase is the tentacles latched on, right? So I can take the causative, and as it says here, I can sort of subtract the explicit agency and replace it with implicit agency, right? So we at least can infer in the second example that the tentacles latched on. The paraphrase in the other direction is potentially more inductive. So you have to add some information to be sure that there's actually agency. Okay? You can also add the agency back in explicitly if you also use a more generic causative verb. So in the last sentence here, the squid got its tentacles to latch on is a paraphrase of the squid attached its tentacles. Right? And that works pretty much in general. Encoded of gives you a relationship between a stative and a change of state. It's also pretty easy to paraphrase. So if I say something like the tentacles latched on, then I can use something like become in order to paraphrase using the state. So again, I have to use sort of both inheritance and this relation in order to manage to make the paraphrase. And also note that even if there's an implication of agency in the first sentence, it's completely lost in the second. So the tentacles latched on, there might be an agent there, you might infer there's an agent there, but when I go up the hierarchy to get, which is a very, very generic causative, then there's not even any real implication of agency. It just sort of seems like one situation happens and then there's another one. Okay. Sorry, become, not get, become. Okay. Now here we finally come to external relations of FrameNet. I'm going to have to be relatively brief on this, unfortunately, but you know where my office is, and you can come and talk to me about this stuff. First, I'm going to talk about relationships to lexical resources, because those are the things that we have the most obvious connection to. And then I'm going to talk about ontologies very briefly. So the most obvious lexical resources to compare to FrameNet are WordNet and PropBank. WordNet, as most of you know, is a resource that classifies words into synsets, but there's no syntagmatic information, right? It doesn't tell you how to use this word. It tells you what it means, but you couldn't make sentences with that word just using WordNet. PropBank tells you what the predicate argument relations are, but they're very generic. So these so-called semantic roles are things like arg0, arg1, and arg2, which, you know, are technically, it's basically whatever the subject is, if it's an agent, kind of can think that if it's an arg0, it's probably an agent. Arg1 is probably a patient, and arg2 is something, if you need it. This is really terrible for verbs like resemble, because you still use arg0, arg1, and arg2 for resemble. And in a case like, if I say, I resemble my father, then there's no agents, there's no patients, there's none of these normal high-level roles. And so you can't, so to speak, trust these labels to have any kind of consistent semantic meaning. Okay? They relate, to be more specific, they know that. So they actually connect this stuff up with something called VerbNet, which aims to provide some level of generalization. But it's usually to something very general. And so you either have very specific, it's the subject of this kind of verb, or very generic, it involves causing things to move. And that's all you know. There are alignments between FrameNet and these other resources. One of them is semlink, which links PropBank, VerbNet, FrameNet, and WordNet. It was done by Martha Palmer, and there's a web address there that you can visit, and it's there. You can use it. I know the guy, he's my office mate, who did the mapping to FrameNet, and it's as good as it can be given the fact that the resources are not actually very comparable. So the trouble with this particular effort is that, for example, with WordNet, they took the sets of different meanings that belong to a word. And when they initially tried just to use the sets of meanings that belong to a particular word, they couldn't manage to figure out what they belonged to. And so they collapsed these distinctions. So the alignment is actually not to WordNet exactly. The alignment is to a collapsed set of distinctions, which is in some ways good and in some ways bad. The reason why it's bad is because they did it purely on the basis of annotator agreement. Now that sounds like a good thing, but the trouble is that that doesn't tell you anything about how useful it's going to be for reasoning. So imagine, for example, that we collapse break to two different types. So there's a lot of meanings of break, so let's take a break. Or let's just stick to the verbs. So war broke out versus I broke out of the room versus I broke the box versus, right? So there's all of these different uses of break. Imagine, if you will, it would be really very easy as an annotator to just make two groups, transitive and intransitive. And that's kind of what they ended up doing a lot of the time. Not usually quite so extreme, but the groups are much more syntactic than they are semantic. And that means that when you want to do reasoning, you can't tell if something just finished or if something doesn't work anymore. Right? So it's very difficult to use this for further reasoning processes or for representation of knowledge or for search or for any of these other things. So they get very high annotator agreement on stuff that isn't as meaningful as what we would like. And in general, those senses that they collapse WordNet down to are the basis of the prop bank annotation as well. So at that level, the distinctions in prop bank are also very, very syntactically based. So it's not as useful as you would like. Okay. Other aligned lexical resources. There is this very, very new alignment. Olya Gurevich was a FrameNetter. So as usual, you know, a FrameNetter has to be in there if there's going to be any alignment to FrameNet. And this does something much more extensive in that it aligns WordNet, FrameNet, VerbNet, Wikipedia, Wiktionary, and OmegaWiki, which is pretty good stuff. It uses ISO LMF, the lexical markup framework, which basically contains the kind of information you would want. So you can take this as an endorsement from me that I actually think that unlike previous international standards efforts, this has some chance of actually representing the kind of information that we have in FrameNet. So I like it. We've had a project going at FrameNet for a long time to directly align FrameNet and WordNet. Because as I said before, if you align FrameNet to prop bank, and then you use that alignment to sort of have a big alignment between everything, then basically there's, because prop bank sense distinctions are sort of syntactically based, then that means you have to map many different FrameNet examples onto one thing in prop bank, and then you map from prop bank to many different WordNet senses. So you end up not getting very much information from that. So we've been involved for several years now in a project that aims to more directly integrate the resources. This is tough because FrameNet is big and WordNet is even bigger in terms of the number of words that are involved. And the resources have very different philosophies. And we have a different kind of data model. So we're different in pretty much every way we can be. But WordNet is used by everybody, and we assume WordNet will be used by anybody who wants to use our stuff for computational stuff. If you want to do any computational semantics, you definitely want to use WordNet, and we at least want you to be able to use FrameNet in a integrated way, so that you don't have to completely change everything and do two totally separate processes. So what do we have out of this? We ended up having some very detailed discussion, but no definitive publications that have resulted from that yet, although we're still talking about it. And there are a small number of very, very detailed analyses. So here you see something that you probably can't see. Is it possible that you could zoom in? So here you see that there's a separation scene. It's actually pretty hard to read. I didn't realize my font was so bad. So there's a high-level separation scene. And that's what's in the middle in blue, where the patient is the whole entity. So, for example, if I take something like I cut the paper, then I take some whole entity, and then in general, I'm separating something. I might be separating a subpart, so if I cut the paper, maybe it's not in two pieces, maybe it is. Then in all of this, you can see that there are, in this particular case, there is an implication that you end up with two parts. So you end up with parts or parts 1 and 2. At the bottom, cut 29, that's a reference, these are references to WordNet sense numbers. They're standard, and I'm going to look at those a little bit more later. For example, you can see that this is a creation sense. So for example, cut firewood. So when you cut a tree and then you make pieces, then this actually creates firewood, right? So there's a sense of cut which inherits from creation and has this scene as its background of separating things into pieces. There are actually a bunch more of these. So there's another creation sense here where I cut out dolls, for example, from a piece of paper. So I can make paper dolls by cutting, cutting, cutting. And it's not all of the pieces that are going to be the created entity. It's actually the sort of positive space, and then there's a negative space that I just sort of throw away and is irrelevant. This is very different from the firewood case. And we can go on and on. This diagram is up on my website, and I'll point you guys to it so that you can find it. So let's zoom back out. Okay. So we also produced, because this is so time-consuming, right? I mean, what I was just talking about, I'm looking at all of the senses of cut, and there's something like 32 of them in WordNet, and then aligning them to all the senses of cut in FrameNet, and also making new frames for all the cases where we didn't have a frame. That ends up being a lot of work. I think it was interesting, and it was very useful, but it would also be nice to have an automated method. The automated method is not going to create new frames for us, but it might be able to suggest what the closest frame is, at least, and handle some of the easier cases. So, in the course of this project, we also produced a methodology for automatically suggesting alignments. This was work with Oscar Ferrandes, and it's based on ranking each pair of synsets and frames. So all of the frames that contain cut, all of the synsets that contain cut. You compare each of them individually, and for each of them, you rate how similar the other words are. And you weight that by how distant they are. How many links outward do you have to go in order to find, for example, all of the words that are in the FrameNet cutting frame? How far do you have to go from this particular synset in order to find all of the words that are in there? Once you do that, then actually it works pretty well, and you get a pretty decent automatic alignment. What it doesn't do very well is tell you whether or not that's actually the right frame. So it will suggest alignments. It'll give you the best alignment, but it doesn't tell you whether the best alignment is crap. And you know, we've done a lot of thinking about how to try and get it to have a confidence score or something like that, but no idea how to do it. If anybody has ideas about this, that would be awesome. And I would love you forever. Okay, I love you forever anyway. Also, we continued this work in what is called the multiply annotated subcorpus. So in this work, both projects, WordNet and FrameNet, annotate words from the American National Corpus, and we proceeded word by word because that's how WordNet does things. And, you know, we negotiated on various points, but the idea of taking an entire frame and doing it that way was not going to work for the WordNet people. So we do an entire word. This means an arbitrary number of frames that we have to create in FrameNet, so it's a lot of work. And then we annotate the same sentences that they're annotating the WordNet sentences on. So this actually exists. There is a small multiply annotated subcorpus where all of the words that were chosen in the course of this project, which is something like 200 different words, many of them pretty frequent, have annotations for WordNet and FrameNet. And as a result of that, we went through and we looked at all of the senses of a word and figured out how the FrameNet senses would align to the WordNet senses, right? I mean, this is a way of doing an implicit alignment by, you know, both of us annotate. And then when we've done that, then you can look at the annotated sentences and see how much agreement there was, basically, right? So here's some WordNet examples. Sense number 1 of win is to be the winner in a contest or competition, be victorious, he won the gold medal, etc. Sense number 2 is acquire, win or gain, to win something through one's effort. So I acquired a passing knowledge of Chinese, or gain an understanding of international finance. I think it's unfortunate that they use knowledge for both of these, knowledge and understanding not being very different, but it's actually intended to be a bit more broad than that. Third, gain, advance, win, pull ahead, etc. The home team was gaining ground, etc. Succeed, win, come through. The enterprise succeeded. She struggled to overcome her handicap and won. I'm actually not a big believer in this last sense. I think it's a productive metaphor. But anyway, at any rate, we have all that. And here you have the FrameNet senses. Interestingly, we also have 4 senses. We have win prize. So that's to receive an award for a competition. So I won first place. Or it's Yeah, sorry. It's really just the win first prize or win first place. Second one is finish competition win. So I won the game. Third one is acquire through effort or fortune. And that's like win the lottery. Or I won 20 bucks betting on the horses or things like that. Or I won 20 bucks by hitting the bullseye. Finish game win is to complete a game with a favorable outcome. Sorry, that one is, yeah, sorry, these are two different ones. So the win here is just we won. The win here is we won the game. It's kind of terrible that we have to make all these distinctions, but all of these have different frame elements. And in fact, there are different words that participate. So, for example, comparing to lose or tie, from a FrameNet perspective, you want to compare those guys. Those are the sort of other possible outcomes in some of these situations, but not all of them. So, for example, the getting sense of win, you don't lose something in that sense, right? So if I won 20 bucks at the races, then if I failed to win 20 bucks, then lose is not as good. You might, if you actually had to put a bet there, say I lost 20 bucks, but you don't say the thing that you didn't get. You just say the thing that you lost because it was a bet. So that's actually a different thing. Tie is only possible for senses number 2 and 4. Anyway, let's just say that there's a bunch of stuff to say about that, about how the different words participate in the different frames. But the one thing to note is that these don't actually line up very well to the WordNet senses. They have 4, we have 4, but actually we're collapsing distinctions that they're making, and we're making distinctions that they collapse. In the end, what this means is that you end up with a many-to-many relationship, or you decide that the WordNetters are crazy, and you collapse some of their distinctions and then redistribute them FrameNet-wise, or you decide that you want a more detailed resource, which you could only get by looking at these annotations and deciding, well, actually, all 4 distinctions are valid in WordNet and all 4 are valid in FrameNet. So actually, there are 16 senses, right? You can imagine that it would be that bad. At any rate, the last word is not yet written on how to align these 2 resources. All right. I'm really not going to say a lot about ontologies other than to just sort of point you at them. So we have worked on connections to Sumo, the suggested upper merged ontology. That's work with Adam Pease, Jan Szewczyk, and myself, where we aligned the high-level frames of FrameNet to things which are in Sumo. I'm going to speak really frankly and say I found that experience amazingly frustrating. The reason why is because not all ontologists, but many of them, want a form of precision that is not actually appropriate for language. And so the only way you can align to a resource that insists on knowing whether something is real or not, right? Most ontologies have a distinction between real and unreal. Language usually doesn't. I use the word run whether or not someone actually ran somewhere, or whether I'm metaphorically describing something as running, or whether I'm hypothesizing that someone might run, or predicting that someone might run, or imagining that someone might run. So this is not actually a distinction that happens very well in language, right? And that's normally the top split of an ontology. Everything has to be categorized as real or an abstraction. It's either some physical thing that is in the world, or it's you thinking about stuff. And language refuses to be categorized in this way. So any ontology that has that as its primary split is not going to align straightforwardly to language. Effectively, in my opinion, what you would end up with is an ontology where you take everything in FrameNet and you put it in both sides. And that's not very satisfying. It just sort of says, you know, everything could be real or it could be imagined. But that's true. But it does mean that you're not going to be able to make your most basic decision, that what they consider to be their most basic decision, on the basis of FrameNet or any other lexical resource. So because I had so much discussion with that problem, I found it very frustrating. If we had just come to the conclusion that we should have FrameNet twice, that would have been much less frustrating. Unfortunately, it wouldn't even be that easy because we also have to make distinctions between how many participants are involved. So, for example, ontologies often differentiate between single participant events and multiple participant events. But you can't always tell. For example, talk. Talk you can use if just there is some speech sound which is coming out from me. I don't have to have an addressee. If I make some speech sounds, it counts as talking, at least in English. However, I optionally have an addressee. Well, now I have two participants. Or if we counted message before as a participant, then before we had two, and now we have three. So it's also not possible to neatly characterize language in those grounds, and that's also often a top-level distinction in ontologies. Very frustrating. So there's a little bit more hope for Dolce. There is at least an entire chunk of Dolce which is dedicated to language and modeling language. So I have found my conversations with, for example, Abdul Ganjemi much less frustrating. But it's also is, it's a little bit worrisome to me that there is a distinction in the ontology still between the part which is about real stuff and the part which is just, so to speak, just language. Because, again, we, when we're actually using language, don't really make that distinction. Knowledge is knowledge, and it might be represented as language, or it might be represented some other way. And so, it's frustrating to some degree. There's one more effort that I've had something to do with, which is the alignment to the Hunter Labs ontology, which is a ontology about movement of stuff in cells. So it's a very, very focused ontology about how things move in and out of a cell. So it's really not very broad, but it's really extremely important for people who are doing biomedical informatics. So let's say, for example, that you're sitting in a field where an article is published faster than one every second. If you're in the medical field, you are sitting that kind of thing. You cannot possibly read an entire article every second. So it's very easy to miss things which are relevant for your research. So there's an entire field in which people are trying to make these resources searchable. So in order to do that, they try to formalize concepts and so on. But one of the things that is very natural about natural language is that whenever we write even a scientific article about things moving into and out of cells, we still use everything that we use in language normally. So yeah, there's some specialist terms that are only going to be found in that field. So I can give you one terrible word, upregulate. So upregulate is in a biological context where one kind of stimulus causes a change in some chemical upward. So it increases the production of that biological thing. Okay, that one's specific to biology. It makes reference to biology specifically. But if I then say increase instead of upregulate, which I could say just as easily, that's part of not just biology. Sure, it is part of biology, but it's also a part of a much larger field. And what if I didn't say increase? What if I said mounted? What if I said went up? What if I said shot up? What if I said skyrocketed? What if I said any of these other things? So each of those has a different set of implications about how quickly it changed. So it's very useful to be able to use them. But effectively, if you're trying to model these medical texts, then you end up needing to produce an entire lexical resource. So it's very attractive to them to be able to align to something like FrameNet and basically figure out how the sort of biomedically specific concepts relate to what we have going on. And that was the work of Andy Dolby in his dissertation and in some articles that we did together. Okay. I think we're going to end here, even if it's a little bit early. There's some additional readings that I can recommend. Ferrandes et al., 2009. This is a paper in the context where they're using these alignments in order to do rich textual entailment. Then there's a paper by Oltamari et al., enriching ontologies with linguistic content. Okay?